Hello everyone, and welcome back to the second of our three lectures on the Qazaq Khanate. In our previous lecture, we discussed some of the general principles and dynamics of the Chinggis political system. And in this lecture, we're going to look at some more concrete historical examples that illustrate these principles. And we will examine how these dynamics played a role in the events leading up to the formation of the Qazaq Khanate. Now, I want to begin by offering a few brief notes on the territory that we are discussing here in this lecture and in subsequent lectures, namely the Eurasian steppe region. This is a territory that is commonly known today and since the 16th century as the Qazaq steppe, for reasons that we will discuss further in this lecture. However, prior to that, and at least since the 11th century, it was known under the title of the Dasht Kipchak. Dasht being a Persian word that means steppe, and Kipchak referring to the Turkic peoples who lived in this region. The term Kipchak itself is primarily a linguistic reference used to refer to one subdivision of the Turks who speak the Kipchak branch of the Turkic language. This includes the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Tatars, Bashkirs, and a number of others as well. And one feature of the Dasht Kipchak that makes it very challenging to study for historians is that until relatively recently, we have very, very few writings that are produced by people who actually live within this region. Nearly all of the available sources we have that tell us about events in this region were written by neighboring peoples, such as the Russians, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Persians, and others. The peoples who lived within the steppe itself were predominantly nomadic, were non-literate, they operated largely on the basis of oral tradition, and so they generally did not keep much in the way of written records that historians can consult today. The Turks of the steppe did, of course, have a very strong tradition of oral history, some examples of which were written down by people in neighboring areas and hence are available to us today. But by and large, they did not keep written records, and therefore it's very difficult for historians today to know with any certainty what was occurring within the steppe. So we are relying instead upon what people outside of the steppe told us about what is happening there. And this remained the case really down to the second half of the 19th century, following the Russian conquest, when with the development of schools, an increase in literacy, we begin to see an increasing number of Kazakhs who are adopting writing and begin writing their own history of the region. But until then, and throughout most of the history of the Qazaq Khanate, we simply do not have hardly any sources produced by Kazakhs themselves. Unlike most of their neighbors, the Qazaq Khans do not appear to have patronized the creation of any historical chronicles. We'll talk more in the next lecture about why this might have been the case, but for now, it's important to note that virtually everything we know about the history of the Kazakhs down to the 19th century is based on things written by non-Kazakhs. And of course, this poses a great many problems for us as historians, of which we need to be aware. So we'll discuss some of these issues further in subsequent lectures, but just keep in mind for now that the history we are discussing in this and in subsequent lectures is based on the very limited supply of information available to us, and it may be subject to change in the future as new sources of information become available. Our historical discussion here. As you will recall from previous lectures, by the end of the 13th century, the massive empire established by Chinggis Khan and his descendants had fragmented into four independent parts. Now in this lecture, we're going to focus on two of them in particular that are of relevance for the history of the Dasht Kipchak or the Qazaq steppe. And these are, beginning with the Golden Horde, or the Ulus of Jochi in the north and in the west, and to a somewhat lesser degree, the Khanate of Chagatai, which covered much of the territory of present-day southern Central Asia, Afghanistan, the northwest areas of present-day China. The two other parts of the former Mongol Empire, namely the Ilkhanate in Iran in the Middle East and the Yuan dynasty in China, are not as relevant for this discussion, although you should at least be aware of where they're located. So we'll start by looking at events within the Golden Horde. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, throughout the 13th century, the leadership of the Golden Horde was largely divided between the descendants of Jochi's sons Batu and Orda. Early 14th century, in the year 1313 to be exact, a new Khan came to power in the Golden Horde by the name of Uzbek, who was a descendant of Batu. And Uzbek would go on to become one of the most powerful rulers in the entire history of the Golden Horde, someone who was able to consolidate power to a much greater degree than anyone after him. Now, there were a number of factors that made him such a powerful ruler, but one of the unique things that he did was that he was one of the very first Mongol rulers to convert to Islam. Now, later in this course, we're going to have an entire series of lectures on religion and on the role of Islam in the history of Kazakhstan, in which we will discuss these events and their significance in much greater detail. But I want to just briefly mention it here because it does have some political significance for our discussion of this topic. Now, Uzbek was not the earliest Mongol ruler to become a Muslim. That was actually Berke, an earlier Han of the Golden Horde. But Berke's successors after him abandoned Islam and returned to the traditional Mongol religion. So Berke was not able to institutionalize the role of Islam within the Golden Horde. But we do see this occurring with Uzbek Khan. We see a decisive shift in the politics of the Golden Hordes toward becoming what we might say a Muslim state. And we see a much greater degree of patronage of Islamic institutions and such within this territory. So it's important to note that a great portion of the population of the Golden Horde, particularly in its eastern part, was Muslim. This was the case before the Mongol conquest and continued to be the case after the Mongol conquest. So by adopting Islam, Uzbek Khan was able to secure a much greater degree of support from among the broader Muslim population of the Golden Horde, which allowed him to consolidate his power, essentially bringing the Mongol elite much closer to the broader population. So Uzbek Khan is a good example of how one individual within the Chinggisid political system can consolidate power, in this case through gaining the support of religious officials and constituencies. And another thing that made Uzbek Khan a very significant person in the history of the Golden Horde is the fact that long after his death in 1341, a large portion of the eastern part of the Golden Horde becomes known thereafter as the Uzbek Ulus, or the people of Uzbek. And in particular, it was these portions of the Golden Horde that had a majority Muslim population that came to be part of this Uzbek Ulus. Now, we have a statement from a prominent Uzbek historian from the 17th century who tells us why this name was given to these people. He writes that Uzbek Khan brought the people and the Ulus to the faith of Islam. Thanks to this possessor of good fortune, all the people had the honor of receiving the glory of Islam. And it is after him that the people of Jochi were called the people of Uzbek. So as you can see from the map, the territory of the Uzbek Ulus included the bulk of the territory of the Dashti Kipchak. And this area, for nearly 2 centuries after the death of Uzbek Khan, continues to be referred to as the Uzbek Ulus, and in Persian sources as Uzbekistan, meaning the land of the Uzbeks. So interestingly, if you're looking for Uzbekistan on the map in the 15th century, you would find it located not on the territory of present-day Uzbekistan, but rather on the territory of present-day Kazakhstan. Now, there are a number of other events that occurred in the late 14th and the early 15th century that are also important for our discussion here. First, there are a number of important events that occur within the territory of the Khanate of Chagatai, to the south of the Golden Horde in Central Asia. In the mid-14th century, there is a split that occurs within the Khanate of Chagatai, and the Khanate essentially divides into 2 halves. The eastern part of the Khanate becomes known thereafter as the independent Khanate of the Mughals, or Mughalistan. Mughal being a version of the word Mongol. Now, the reasons for this split are complex and not important for our discussion here, but it's important to mention this event because, as we will see, the region of Mughalistan comes to play a very important role in the early history of the Qazaq Khanate, as we will discuss a little bit later in this lecture. Then in the in the western part of the Khanate of Chagatai, in the second half of the 14th century, there comes to power an individual by the name of Amir Timur, someone who I mentioned in my previous lecture. Timur, of course, was not a Chinggisid. He never claimed the position of Khan for himself, but he was a very skilled military leader, and he very quickly became the undisputed ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, or at least the western portion. And he went on to conquer a very large empire, which included not only much of Central Asia, but also the territory of Persia, much of the Middle East, Afghanistan, areas of India. So thereafter he establishes his own dynasty known as the Timurids, who ruled in Iran and Central Asia for about a century, down to the early 16th century. But the region of Mogolistan remains independent from the Timurid Empire. So by the early 15th century, the territory of Central Asia had become divided between the region of Mogolistan in the east and the Timurid Empire in the west. Now, within the Golden Horde to the north, there is a long period of fragmentation and civil war in the late 14th century. And by the early 15th century, we see the emergence of a series of smaller independent Khanates that emerge on the territory of the former Golden Horde. These include the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, and others. And within the Uzbek Ulus, there is a split that occurs as well. A new polity known as the Nogai Horde, under the rule of the Mangit tribe among the Uzbeks, comes into power in the northwestern region of the steppe. And within the central and the eastern areas of the steppe, in the early 15th century, comes under the rule of a clan descended from Jochi's son Shiban, who I mentioned in the previous lecture. So the bulk of the Uzbek Ulus comes under the control of the Shabanic clan within the 15th century. Chart here that illustrates in a different level of detail the various Chinggisid lineages that are at work in this period within the Golden Horde. First, we have the line through Batu of Uzbek Khan, who, as I mentioned, is able to consolidate power in the early 14th century. But even though Uzbek Khan was a very powerful ruler, so powerful to the extent that even long after him, the territory that had been ruled by him becomes continuously known as the Uzbek Ulus. His descendants actually lose power after the mid-14th century. And thereafter, the line of Batu does not actually play a very significant role in the politics of the Golden Horde. Now, as I mentioned, we see a period of fragmentation in the second half of the 14th century. Now, out of this, the line of Shaban emerges from another son of Jochi. And from the clan of Shaban, a figure by the name of Abu Khair is proclaimed Khan in 1428. And thereafter, Abu Khair dominates the steppe and the territory of the Uzbek Ulus for a period of about 40 years, until his death in 1468 or 69. But there was also a great deal of opposition that developed against Abu Khair during his Khanate, and a number of different groups felt that his rule was oppressive, and they began looking for alternative candidates to support. And one of the main centers of opposition that emerged against Abu Khair are two brothers whose names are probably familiar to you. They are Girey and Janibek. And Girey and Janibek are descendants of yet another son of Jochi named Tokai Timur, whose line historically had not played a very significant role in the politics of the Golden Horde. But nonetheless, as we see here, they do come to play an important role more than 200 years later, at a time when people were searching for an alternative to the rule of Abu Khair. So their case demonstrates yet again one of the important political principles of the Chinggisid system, which is that even after several centuries, any member of the extended family of Jochi can still lay a claim to power and authority within the territory of the Jochi Ulus. Girey and Janibek established themselves as the co-rulers of a new Khanate, which separates from the Khanate of Abu Khair. And they became known initially as the Uzbek Qazaqs, or those Uzbeks who went Qazaq, and then only later became known simply as the Qazaqs. We'll talk a little more later in this lecture about the reasons for why they were given this title and how it changed over time. Now, initially, Girey and Janibek Khan moved to the east, towards the territory of Mogolistan, and there they were given protection by Ihsan Buqa Khan, who was the Khan of Mogolistan at that time. So they formed an alliance with the rulers of Mogolistan against Abu Khair, which lasted for quite a long time. And originally, the group of followers of Girey and Janibek were not very numerous, but they increased significantly after the death of Abu Khair Khan in 1468, when the Uzbek Ulus fell into a state of disorder, and many people from within the Uzbek Ulus who were seeking safety and protection went over to the side of the Qazaqs. Now, Abu Khair's son Haidar attempts to succeed him in the position of Khan after his death, but there is widespread opposition to him, and he is murdered sometime in the early 1470s. So after that, the lineage of Abu Khair begins to lose power within the steppe. And after this, Gilly and Johnny Beck are able to consolidate their power within the central and the eastern parts of the steppe. So leadership of the steppe then passes from the Shabani clan to the Tokai Timurida clan, or the people who we refer to today as the Qazaqs. And thereafter, the Qazaqs remain the dominant force in the steppe, at least down to the 18th century, as we will see. The Shabanid clan, after the death of Abuhair's son Haidar, comes under the leadership of a grandson of Abuhair named Muhammad, who becomes known as Muhammad Shabani Khan. Now, after fighting a series of conflicts with the Qazaqs, eventually Muhammad Shabani Khan decides to abandon his claims to the steppe and instead organizes a major series of invasions of the southern urban areas of Central Asia against the Timurid Empire. And after a series of campaigns lasting about 10 years, he and his army are able to conquer most of the major urban areas of Central Asia, corresponding approximately to the territory of present-day Uzbekistan. And of course, it is from this conquest that this region comes under the control of the Uzbeks, and is the reason why it becomes known later as Uzbekistan, or the land of the Uzbeks. So the Khanate established by Muhammad Shabani Khan in southern Central Asia continues to be known thereafter in the sources as the Abuhairids, after his grandfather Abuhair Khan. As for the Timurid dynasty, who had previously ruled over Central Asia for the past century, they flee to the south, to India, after their displacement by Muhammad Shabani Khan, and they come under the leadership of a member of their family by the name of Babur, who goes on to establish the Mughal Empire in India. So there's a widespread reconfiguration of geopolitics throughout Central Asia in the early 16th century, which leaves the Kazakhs as the dominant power on the steppe for the next 2 centuries at least. So this brings us to an interesting question, which is why the Kazakhs were called Kazakhs. And for one answer to this, we can look at the account of a very famous historian from the mid-16th century named Muhammad Haidar Dughlat, who was from the region of Moghulestan. Now, this is one of the readings that we have assigned to you for this week, so you will be discussing this and other passages further in your seminar as well. Muhammad Haidar writes, Abuhair Khan dominated the entire Kipchak steppe. Any prince of Jochid lineage he suspected of having seditious thoughts, he wanted to reduce to nothing. A group of Gere Khan and Johnny Bek Khan's princes, as well as a few of Abuhair Khan's own men, took flight and went to Moghulestan. After the death of Abuhair Khan, contention broke out among the Uzbeks, and everyone who could sought refuge for safety and security with Gere Khan and Johnny Bek Khan, and this gave them great power. Since they had first separated from the larger people and were wandering, they were called Kazakhs, and the name stuck. Now, what is important about this passage is as it tells us not only what happened in terms of the events leading up to the establishment of the Kazakh polity, but it also tells us why this group came to be called Kazakhs. And as we can see here, they earned this name not because of any particular ethnic identity, but rather because of what they did. It was their act of separating from the Khanate of Abuhair that earned them the title of Qazaq. Now, this term Qazaq has a very old history in Turkic languages. It is used to refer to someone who goes off on their own, who breaks away from a larger group of people and goes off as an adventurer or a freebooter, oftentimes surviving by raiding or plundering. And it became a very common form of activity throughout much of Eurasia following the Mongol conquests. In fact, it's the same word that lies at the root of the Russian term Cossack, referring to the Cossack communities of present-day Russia and Ukraine, whose origins are found in precisely this same sort of activity. And the word for performing this sort of activity, as some of you might know from your Kazakh language courses, is Kazaklik, which means essentially becoming a Kazakh or doing Kazakh activities. So one who performs the act of Kazaklik is a Kazakh. So, of course, today when we think of the Kazakhs, we tend to think of a distinct ethnic group or nation, someone who is ethnically or linguistically distinct from other groups. But it's important to note that when this term was first applied to this group, it did not have any sort of ethnic significance. It was not used to describe a separate ethnic group. and the Uzbeks, or rather the Kazakhs, were not understood as being ethnically distinct in any way from the broader Uzbek Ulus. They shared the same language, the same religion, Islam, broadly the same traditions as the broader people of the Uzbek Ulus. And in fact, the sources throughout the 15th and the 16th century continued to describe them as Uzbeks. The term that Haydar Dukalat uses in his source is Uzbek Kazakhs, basically those Uzbeks who perform Kazakhlek. And in fact, they are not the only people in this period who are being referred to as Kazakhs. We know of a number of other groups who also split off from the Khanate of Abulkhair in the 15th century, who were also called Kazakhs for this exact same reason. Now, these groups later disappeared from history, but again, their existence demonstrates the way in which this term was used in this period. As I mentioned in sources throughout the 15th and 16th century, the Kazakhs continued to be described as Uzbeks as part of the broader Uzbek Ulus. An early 16th century author named Ruzbahan Hunji describes the Uzbek people as being divided into three parts: the Abulkharids in the south, the Kazakhs in the central and eastern areas of the steppe, and the Nogai horde, who I had mentioned earlier, to the north and the western areas of the steppe. So all three of these groups, according to this and other 16th century authors, were still considered Uzbeks in the broader sense. In fact, it's also clear from the sources from this period that the boundaries between these groups was very flexible. We see many examples from the sources of individuals and groups who move between these categories, particularly between the Abulkharid, Khanate, and the Kazakhs. You'll see several examples of this in your readings, but also between the Nogai Ulus and the Kazakhs as well. So, which shows again that the difference between these labels was not so much ethnic as it was political. One became a Kazakh simply by following one of the Qazaq Khans. And it was for the same reason that we see another development that occurs in the steppe in the course of the 17th century, where following the in the Russian conquest of the former territories of the Golden Horde, a number of tribes from the Nogai Horde from the west migrate to the east and join with the Kazakhs. And this leads to the formation of a separate polity among the Kazakhs that becomes known gradually as the Junior Horde or the Little Horde. A little bit later to the east, the Jungar conquest of Mogolistan forces a number of tribes from this region, including some members of the Duklat tribe, to migrate to the west and also join with the Kazakhs. And this alliance then becomes a seed of what becomes the Great or the Senior Horde among the Kazakhs. So by the second half of the 17th century, the Kazakhs had become divided into three hordes or juzes. So again, this demonstrates that the question of Kazakh identity remained very flexible throughout this period and was defined primarily in political rather than ethnic terms. However, it's clear that at some point the term Kazakh did start to take on a more ethnic connotation, and the Kazakhs gradually came to be known as a separate group of people from the Uzbeks, while the term Uzbek gradually came to be applied more specifically only to the population of the Abulkharid Khanate in southern Central Asia, or the people who we know today as the Uzbeks. It's not clear exactly when this development occurred. It is clear that it was a very gradual process. But it's important to note here that the sense of Kazakh identity that we understand today as an ethnic or national label was not applicable in earlier centuries. So we need to be very cautious in terms of how we apply these labels historically. Thank you.